We just survived an absolute marathon, 100 games in 100 minutes. I spent an hour and a half violently digging through the absolute worst, most broken, visually offensive budget bin disasters the PlayStation ever allowed onto a retail shelf. By the time that timer hit 0, I genuinely believed I had seen the absolute lowest point of this console's entire library. I thought my tolerance for bad video games had been permanently maxed out. I was completely wrong. Because waiting for us right on the other side of that finish line is the final boss of the bargain bin. A game with a reputation so famously toxic, so historically catastrophic, that its very name is used as the universal benchmark for 32-bit failure. We have reached the massive 200 game milestone of the index, and to celebrate, we are forcing ourselves to look directly into the sun. Welcome to the nightmare that is Bubsy 3D. If you weren't reading gaming magazines back in 1996, it is almost impossible to accurately explain the sheer, unearned arrogance of this game's marketing campaign. The developers didn't just quietly release this into the wild, hoping to make a quick buck of confused grandparents. They aggressively positioned this obscure, deeply irritating bobcat as the undisputed king of the new generation. They took out massive, full-page ads actively mocking the heavyweights of the era, boldly claiming this was going to be the definitive platforming experience that would completely rewrite the rulebook for the entire industry. Instead, they delivered a product that fundamentally misunderstands the basic concept of how to move a digital object through a three-dimensional space. It is a game that looks like a rejected Microsoft Paint file, controls like a massive piece of industrial machinery stuck in mud, and actively insults you through the television speakers while you try to play it. I have spent years hearing the hushed legends about how terrible this disc actually is, but no amount of internet hyperbole could have adequately prepared me for putting the game in the tray and experiencing the disaster firsthand. It is officially time to face the music. We are grabbing a controller, taking a deep breath, and tearing apart the most infamous platformer of the decade. Welcome to the PSX Index. I'm Parasine, and this is the show where I play and document all 1,278 PS1 games released across Northern America, and this episode is Index Entry 200. We need to set the stage here, because you cannot truly appreciate the magnitude of this disaster without understanding the era it was born into. The year is 1996, and the video game industry is having a massive collective panic attack. The safe, profitable days of the beautifully drawn 2D side-scrollers are officially dead. The shiny new disc-based consoles are demanding 3D polygons, and absolutely nobody knows how to actually make that work yet. There was no template, the fundamental rules of how a character should jump or even exist in a fully 3D space hadn't been written. Developers were stumbling around in the dark, trying to figure out how to wrangle a camera behind a character without inducing severe motion sickness in the player. Every major publisher was desperately scrambling to be the first one to crack the code, plant their flag in the third dimension, and secure their mascot's legacy. Enter Accolade and a development studio named Eidetic. They looked at this chaotic, completely uncharted territory and decided they were going to be the pioneers. And who did they choose to lead this brave new frontier? A screeching, deeply unpopular bobcat wearing an oversized white t-shirt with a giant exclamation mark on it. Bubsy had already starred in a handful of 16-bit games that were mostly famous for being incredibly frustrating and having a terrible fall damage mechanic. He was a second-string mascot on his absolute best day, but Accolade genuinely believed this was his moment. They brought him into the Polygon era, slapped the 3D label on the box, and prepared to take over the living room. They thought they were building the definitive killer app for the PlayStation, the game that would finally validate their snarky mascot. Instead, they built a digital monument to hubris that they are still talking about 3 decades later. Let's look at what happens when a studio tries to reinvent the wheel, but forgets to make it round. The mid-90s were the absolute peak of the mascot with an attitude era. Sonic the Hedgehog had proven that giving a cartoon animal a slight sneer and some brightly coloured shoes could move millions of consoles. But a lot of publishers learned the exact wrong lesson from that massive success. They thought the secret ingredient was just making the character aggressively obnoxious, and absolutely nobody embodied that misunderstanding quite like Bubsy. Even in the 2D days, Bubsy wasn't exactly beloved. He was a second-tier mascot whose defining character trait was that he never, ever stopped talking. He was essentially just a collection of terrible puns wrapped in a white t-shirt, but instead of looking at the leap to 3D as a chance to reinvent the character and maybe tone him down a bit, Accolade completely doubled down. They looked at the landscape of 1996, saw Nintendo preparing to launch a revolutionary 3D Mario game, and genuinely thought, our screeching bobcat is going to destroy him. The marketing campaign for Bubsy 3D is a fascinating study in corporate delusion. They ran massive, multi-page spreads in gaming magazines that were absolutely dripping with that manufactured 90s edge. The ads didn't just promote the game, they literally mocked the competition. They took direct shots at Mario. They took shots at Crash Bandicoot. They strutted around the print media landscape, acting like they'd just invented the concept of the jumping mechanic. They were pitching this game not just as a fun weekend rental, but as the new gold standard that was going to make every other developer in the industry pack up and go home. It is one thing to release a bad video game. That happens all the time, but it is an entire different level of historical tragedy to release a catastrophic, fundamentally broken game while simultaneously standing on a mountaintop, screaming that you are the greatest thing to ever happen to the medium. The sheer arrogance of the packaging and the magazine spreads set the expectations impossibly high. When kids actually spend their birthday money on this, took it home and booted it up, they weren't just disappointed, they felt actively scammed. The gap between the swagger of the marketing and what the disc actually contained was so massive, it practically created its own gravitational pull. The absolute first thing that hits you when you finally press start on Bubsy 3D is the sheer, uncompromising assault on your retinas. We had already seen some brilliant visual showcases on the PlayStation by 1996. Games that utilised the CD-ROM format to push detailed textures and moody lighting. But booting up this game feels like you accidentally slipped past the title screen and loaded directly into an unfinished mid-development testing environment. The art direction in this game is a complete and utter visual void. The developers made a very specific, deliberate choice to almost entirely abandon the traditional textures. Instead, they relied heavily on a technique called flat gored shading. In theory, this was supposed to allow the console to render the environment at a higher resolution without the frame rate constantly tanking, keeping the game running at a smooth pace. In practice, it resulted in a world that looked like a giant, hostile geometry homework assignment. Every single surface in the game is comprised of these harsh, flat, blindingly bright primary colours. The ground is almost always a hideous, vibrating checkerboard pattern, and the platforms are just massive, untextured floating blocks of neon green, yellow and red. It genuinely looks as though someone booted up a fresh instance of Microsoft Paint in 1995, dragged a few basic shapes onto a blank canvas, hit the fill bucket tool, and then somehow forced the PlayStation to render it in 3 dimensions. But the problem with the visual void isn't just that it's ugly, though it is, aggressively so. The real issue is that abandoning textures completely breaks the fundamental visual language required to actually play a platformer. When you are looking at 2 massive, perfectly flat red rectangles floating in a perfectly flat blue sky, your brain has absolutely no point of reference to judge the distance between them. There is no texture grain, no realistic shadow mapping, and no environmental detail to help you calculate the depth. You are constantly trying to line up precision jumps in a world that refuses to give your eyes any depth perception whatsoever. You end up just blindly hurling this screeching bobcat into the digital abyss, hoping the neon green square is actually where you think it is. It is a game that is not only visually repulsive, but one where the art direction actively and meticulously sabotages your ability to play it.
See that thing in front of you? That's a switch. Just run into it to make something cool happen. Come on, don't be shy. Step right up and win valuable prizes. Shoot the woolly with the atom. Yippee! A rocket! Find 31 more of these and we're like yesterday's clams. Chowder here. Well, let's go get the other one. There's 2 on every level, you know.
If the art direction was the only problem with Bubsy 3D, it might have just been remembered as an ugly, forgettable curiosity, but the moment you actually put your thumb on the D-pad and try to move the character, the true nightmare reveals itself. The developers looked at the brand new frontier of 3D platforming and made a mechanical decision that is so bafflingly incorrect, it almost feels like an act of internal sabotage. They gave a precision platformer mascot tank controls. Let that sink in for a second. If you wanted to play Resident Evil, a game about slowly, methodically creeping down narrow hallways while trying to avoid zombies, tank controls made perfect sense. You press up to go forward, you press left and right to slowly rotate your character on a central axis. It builds tension because you are sluggish and vulnerable. Now imagine that exact same heavy, restrictive movement scheme and applying it to a hyperactive cartoon bobcat who needs to make pixel-perfect jumps across floating, microscopic geometry squares. It is an absolute catastrophe. If you want to run diagonally to the right, you cannot just press diagonally on the D-pad. You have to stop entirely, slowly rotate Bubsy until he is facing the correct angle, and then press forward. You are essentially trying to navigate a high-speed obstacle course while parallel parking a forklift. To make matters infinitely worse, there is absolutely no sense of gradual momentum. The second you press forward, Bubsy immediately accelerates to his absolute maximum sprinting speed. He rockets across these tiny, untextured platforms like he was fired out of a cannon, and because you are constantly fighting the rotational tank controls, you spend half your time just launching yourself directly into the abyss because you are angled 3 degrees too far to the left. When you actually manage to line up a jump, the physics engine seems to completely give up. Bubsy's jump arc is stiff, unpredictable, and feels completely disconnected from whatever speed you had before you left the ground. He does have a glide mechanic, which is theoretically supposed to help you correct your landing, but because you have zero depth perception, thanks to the completely flat graphics, you usually just end up gently floating directly past the platform and falling to your death anyway. It is a control scheme that fights your natural instincts at every single turn, turning what should be a simple hop into an exhausting, infuriating chore. As if wrestling the forklift controls while floating in a textureless void wasn't enough of a punishment, Bubsy 3D introduces a third, entirely separate antagonist into the mix: the camera. In the early days of 3D gaming, camera management was famously the hardest puzzle for developers to solve, but even grading on that highly generous 1996 curve, the camera in this game behaves like a genuinely malicious entity that actively wants you to fail. Because you are chained to those horrific rotational tank controls, the camera is rigidly tethered directly behind the back of Bubsy's head. Where he turns, the camera slowly, rigidly follows. The immediate problem with this is how the camera reacts to the environment. If you back up too close to a wall, or if you attempt to jump near one of the game's massive blocky textures, the camera does not pan out. It does not smartly reposition itself above you to give you a better angle. It doesn't even turn the wall transparent. Instead, it just violently shoves itself forward, zooming entirely too close to the action. Half the time, you are trying to make a pixel-perfect blind jump while the camera is effectively resting inside Bubsy's ear canal. But the absolute worst part of the camera system happens when you combine it with the art direction we talked about in the last section, because every single surface in the game is a completely flat, textureless polygon. Getting the camera stuck on a wall is a deeply disorienting nightmare. If the camera slips behind a large green block, your entire television screen simply becomes a solid, unbroken wall of neon green. There are no shadow or texture lines to tell you that you are looking at a wall. It just looks like your television is broken. You instantly lose all spatial awareness, desperately mashing the D-pad to try and unstick yourself from the geometry before a low poly enemy wanders over and kills you. The developers did technically include a button that lets you look around the environment in first person to plan your route, but using it completely stops your momentum and freezes you in place. So you are left with two terrible options. You can either blindly leap into the geometry abyss with a camera that refuses to show you where you are going, or you can stop every 3 seconds to manually survey the flat, confusing landscape like a lost tourist. It creates a stuttering, stop-and-go pace that completely kills any potential joy you could possibly wring out of the platforming genre.
The stuff. An X-Man. Goodie!
If wrestling the tank controls and the catastrophic camera wasn't quite enough to break your spirit, the developers made absolutely sure to include one final layer of torment. They engineered an auditory experience so aggressively grating that it genuinely elevates Bubsy 3D from a mere technical failure into an act of psychological warfare. The defining characteristic of Bubsy as a mascot was always his voice. In the 16-bit era, his attitude and his little quips were an entire brand. So when they brought him into the CD-ROM age, they took that massive increase in storage space and used it to ensure that this bobcat literally never ever stops talking. Every single action you perform in this game is tethered to a highly compressed, piercingly high-pitched voice line. If you jump, he talks. If you deploy your glide, he talks. If you pick up one of the spinning atoms that litter the levels, he delivers a one-liner. If you make the mistake of putting the controller down for more than 3 seconds to rub your tired eyes and reconsider your life choices, he launches into a painfully unfunny idle monologue. The game is packed with an endless barrage of terrible, fourth wall breaking 90s snark. And because the controls are so unresponsive and the camera is so chaotic, you are going to die. A lot. Every single time you miss a platform and plummet into the neon abyss, you are forced to listen to him screech something completely obnoxious. Hearing him confidently yell his signature catchphrase, "What could possibly go wrong?" while you are actively watching his low poly body clip through the solid green wall and fall to his demise is an incredibly surreal experience. It stops being a quirky catchphrase and quickly morphs into a genuine and malicious taunt. The audio compression just adds to the misery. He sounds like he is trapped inside a tin can that is being violently shaken next to a microphone. It is a relentless, exhausting barrage of noise that completely shreds whatever thin layer of patience you had left. There is actually an option buried in the menus to turn his voice lines down, but by the time most players realised that was even possible in 1996, the damage was already done. The voice acting isn't just a bad feature, it actively compounds your frustration. When you combine the visual void, the forklift controls, and the endless screeching puns, you get the perfect storm of an awful game design that actively pushes you to just reach over and hit the power button.
Excuse me. Excuse me. Now then, using the stored atom capacity he built up in his fur,
which I'd like to add was stolen at the expense of the Water, Water and Power Company. You'll find this reflected in next month's electricity bill.
Really, if I could be allowed to continue. Using the stored atom capacity he built up in his fur, the prisoner was able to make an escape.
Now, this cloud does have a wool lining. Our understanding is that the hairy fiend did not procure enough rockets to build a complete model. Professor?
Yes, General, you are correct. For example, this ship has neither an oscillation overthruster nor a flux capacitor. Ahem. Without these items, the ship's secondary inversion nasal invariant beam will emit a tachyon pulse that...
In short, Mr. Fuzzy will find the rockets will not be able to return to Earth. Instead, it should be stranded somewhere between Saturn and Uranus.
If the tank controls, the blinding camera, and the relentless auditory assault weren't quite enough to completely break your spirit, we need to talk about the actual arenas you are forced to navigate. The level design in Bubsy 3D is a masterclass in how absolutely not to build a three-dimensional platformer. When you look back at the competition in 1996, the best developers were actively trying to build cohesive, believable worlds. Crash Bandicoot gave us dense, focused jungle paths. Mario 64 gave us a massive, interconnected castle filled with distinct, themed paintings. Bubsy's alien planet of Rayon, on the other hand, is just a chaotic, nonsensical jumble of floating geometry shapes hovering over a pixelated void. There is absolutely no sense of place, no environmental storytelling, and no logical progression. It is just arbitrary blocks stacked up on top of other arbitrary blocks. Because there are no textures and the colour palette is so aggressively limited, there are zero visual landmarks. You can wander around a single map for 15 minutes and have absolutely no idea if you were just walking in circles. Every single flat, neon green ramp looks exactly like the last flat neon green ramp. You cannot use the environment to orient yourself, which turns basic navigation into a deeply confusing, stressful memory test. To make matters worse, the game relies heavily on extreme verticality. You are constantly tasked with climbing towering staircase-like structures to collect rocket pieces and spinning atoms. but because of those forklift controls and a camera that stubbornly refuses to tilt up and down efficiently, scaling these towers is pure agony. You are constantly forced to take massive blind leaps of faith. If you misjudge the distance, which you will, because you have no depth perception, you fall all the way back to the absolute bottom of the map. And as you plummet, Bubsy will inevitably scream another terrible one-liner at you, adding insult to the geographical injury. The core objective is essentially a primitive collectathon, but instead of rewarding your curiosity, the level design actively punishes it. Stepping off the critical path just results in getting hopelessly lost in a maze of identical flat walls. You end up desperately fighting the camera until a completely silent, low polygon alien slowly slides across the checkerboard floor, gently touches your leg, and instantly kills you. It is a level design completely devoid of joy, logic, and basic geographical coherence. It feels less like a video game world and more like an abstract, hostile testing arena designed specifically to waste your time. The true tragedy of Bubsy 3D isn't just that it's a fundamentally broken piece of software. The gaming industry is full of terrible, poorly coded games that we simply laugh at, throw in a drawer, and collectively forget about. What cemented this specific title as a legendary, almost mythical failure was its release window. It suffered from the absolute worst case of historical timing you could possibly imagine. If Accolade had somehow managed to push this out in 1994 or early 1995 as a weird experimental PC tech demo, history might have been slightly more forgiving. Players might have looked at that blindingly flat geometry and the horrific tank controls and simply said, well, navigating the third dimension is clearly very hard, but at least they tried. But they didn't release it in a vacuum. They dropped it onto retail shelves in the fall of 1996. In September of that exact year, Nintendo released Super Mario 64, and they didn't just release a good platformer, they delivered the Rosetta Stone for the entire genre. They completely solved the 3D movement problem by fully utilising analog control, allowing Mario to tiptoe, walk and sprint with perfect fluid momentum. They tackled the camera problem by making it an actual physical entity in the world, Lakitu floating on a cloud that the player could actively manipulate with the C button. They created a dense, brilliantly designed playground that felt phenomenal just to run around in. And then just a few weeks later, Bubsy 3D stumbles out into the spotlight, aggressively demanding that you stop and rotate a screeching bobcat like a rusty turret just to make a single jump onto a textureless green square. It was a digital guillotine. The contrast was so sharp and so immediately obvious to anyone who'd played both games that Bubsy was dead on arrival. Imagine walking into an electronics store in 1996, playing the Mario 64 kiosk for 10 minutes, experiencing the absolute peak of joyful fluid movement, and then going home and paying $50 to aggressively fight the camera in Bubsy's Alien Wasteland. Add to that the fact that Sony's own Crash Bandicoot launched in the exact same window, offering breathtaking, fully textured jungle environments and incredibly tight, focused corridor platforming. Surrounded by absolute genre-defining masterpiece, Bubsy 3D looked like a complete embarrassing joke. The incredibly arrogant magazine ads claiming this game was the Mario killer suddenly looked like the ramblings of a deeply delusional publisher. Super Mario 64 flawlessly wrote the rulebook for how 3D movement should work, and Bubsy 3D instantly became the permanent cautionary example of what happens when you completely ignore it. When a development studio releases a game as universally rivaled and historically broken as Bubsy 3D, the story usually ends right there. In the highly competitive landscape of the mid-90s, one massive, highly publicised failure was typically enough to sink an entire company. The publisher pulls the funding, the team quietly scatters to the wind, and the studio becomes just another forgotten footnote in the great digital graveyard. Eidetic, the development team behind this catastrophe, had every logical reason to close their doors and pretend the whole Bobcat incident never happened. But the video game industry is full of incredibly weird trivia, and Eidetic's survival is arguably one of the greatest redemption arcs in the entire 32-bit generation. They didn't just shut down. Instead, they absorbed the absolute critical thrashing they received, took the incredibly harsh lessons they learned from wrestling with an early 3D engine, and completely pivoted. They entirely abandoned the colourful, mascot-driven platforming engine, partnered up with Sony, and started working on a mature, third-person stealth action game. Just 3 years after unleashing the visual void of Bubsy 3D upon the world, Eidetic released Siphon Filter. The contrast is absolutely staggering. You go from controlling a hyperactive, screeching cartoon animal who handles like a rusty shopping cart, to playing as Gabe Logan, a gravelly-voiced, highly lethal government operative executive, executing precise stealth takedowns. Siphon Filter features dense, fully textured environments, incredibly tight third-person shooting mechanics, and a weapon sandbox that famously included the single greatest, highly combustible taser in the history of the medium. It was an absolute triumph. It became a massive system seller for the PlayStation, spawning a highly respected, multi-game franchise that helped define the console's later years. It is genuinely baffling to sit down, look at the completely flat, neon grid checkboard squares of Bubsy's alien world, and realise that exact same development studio was capable of building the dark, atmospheric subway tunnels of Washington DC just a few years later. It proves that the disaster of Entry 200 wasn't necessarily born from the lack of inherent talent. It was the result of the sheer, chaotic growing pains of the industry desperately trying to figure out how the third dimension actually worked. Eidetic survived the guillotine, learned how to wrangle a camera, and successfully washed the taste of this terrible platformer out of their mouths forever.
I knew I should have taken that left turn at Uranus! Was it something I said? What could possibly go wrong?
We spent a lot of time on this channel praising the absolute visionaries of the PlayStation era. We look at the developers who somehow managed to wring the atmospheric horror out of 32 megabytes of RAM, or the studios that laid the foundational blueprints for the modern action game. But to truly appreciate the genius of the developers who got it right, you have to acknowledge the ones who got it completely, amazingly wrong. Bubsy 3D is not a game you play for fun, it is an absolute endurance test. It is a highly interactive, deeply irritating museum exhibit detailing exactly what happens when corporate hubris collide with fundamentally flawed programming. But in a weird, almost academic way, it is an incredibly important piece of video game history. The mid-90s were the wild west of the medium. There were no established rules, no safety nets, and absolutely no guarantees that a retail disc was going to function logistically when you brought it home from the store. Bubsy stands as the ultimate cautionary tale of that volatile transition. It is the control group for the great 3D experiment. It definitely proves you couldn't just take a snarky, two-dimensional mascot, throw them into the flat polygon void, slap 3D on a dual case, and expect the technology to carry you to the finish line. The leap to 3D demanded mathematical precision. It demanded smart, intuitive camera design, and it demanded an absolute respect for the player's spatial awareness. The team at Accolade largely ignored all of that, and their reward was a permanent, highly visible spot on the Gaming Hall of Shame. It is a miserable, exhausting experience, and I never want to hear that Bobcat's highly compressed voice ever again. But honestly, Forcing ourselves to document these absolute rock bottom failures is exactly why this project exists. We can't just preserve the masterpieces, we have to catalogue the complete disasters too, because without the blinding, textureless nightmares of games like this, we wouldn't have fully understood just how miraculous the good ones actually were. We have officially conquered the 200 game milestone, we survived the 100 game clearance bin speedrun, we survived the blinding textureless geometry voids, and we survived the screeching bobcat with forklift controls. Bubsy 3D is every bit as miserable, broken, and historically offensive as its reputation suggests. It is the absolute rock bottom of the 3-dimensional platform era, and having to physically play it to capture this footage has taken a measurable toll on my sanity. But we documented it, it is in the index now, locked away where it belongs. To properly wash the neon checkerboards out of our eyes, we need a serious palate cleanser. Next time on the channel, we are returning to a very familiar, highly licensed well. We are skipping ahead to the year 2000 and kicking off the Disney Bundle Part 3. We already tackled the early years back in the 30s, and we cleared out the late 90s Renaissance block in the 70s, but now we look at a massive 10-game run from the turn of the millennium. We are leaving the alien wasteland behind and heading into titles like Buzz Lightyear of Star Command, 102 Dalmatians, Puppies to the Rescue, The Emperor's New Groove, and Walt Disney World Quest Magical Racing Tour. It is a huge block of nostalgia, and hopefully the camera actually knows how to follow the characters. Surviving the absolute worst the 32-bit era has to offer means we have crossed a massive threshold. It is officially 200 games down, 1078 to go. If you want to help the channel chip away at that towering number, hit subscribe. We have made a huge dent in the library, but we still have a long road ahead. Click a playlist on your screen to keep the trip going, and I'll see you in the Magic Kingdom. Leave a comment, like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.